Good afternoon, and welcome to everyone attending today's forum in person here in Mathematica's Washington, D.C. office, and the many more people that are attending online. I'm Diane Hers, the Chief Diversity Officer here at Mathematica, and I'm really pleased that so many people have turned out for this important conversation today. The title of today's forum may ring a bell for you. Nothing about us without us. It's an English translation of a Latin phrase that has been used for centuries to convey the idea that no policy should be decided on by representatives without the participation of the people affected by it. The phrase was used as a rallying cry for representative government in 16th century Central Europe, and it became a hallmark of our country's disability movement in the 1990s, disability rights movement. Since then, it's been used by many marginalized groups to advocate for a seat at the table when discussing issues and policies that affect them the most. So it's fitting that we ground our discussion today in this same tradition, exploring how research can and should be done with a community rather than to a community, ensuring that the people with the most to gain or to lose are at the seat, have a seat at the evidence-based table. At Mathematica, we're continually augmenting and reimagining the way that the world gathers data and uses evidence. We know today's discussion will help provide useful insights into how to improve the work that we do. Specifically, culturally responsive research can ensure evaluation and assessment practices are sensitive to the cultures of the people who are most affected by the policies being tested and implemented. It can produce research that will generate relevant and actionable results for those specific communities. And it can ensure that evidence uncovered through those approaches meets the highest levels of rigor. So if you haven't been to one of our forums recently, you'll know that we like to do things a little bit differently. Rather than have presentations, we'll have a moderated discussion, and it will be followed by a substantial amount of time for questions, both from people here in the DC office and online. To lead us today in our conversation, I'm delighted to turn the mic over to Sharon Jones. Sharon Jones is the CEO of Jones Diversity, a lawyer, educator, and consultant with more than 30 years of experience in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. Sharon has been our trusted partner and my trusted partner in helping to shape Mathematica's diversity and inclusion strategy. Thank you for joining us, Sharon.
Thank you, Diane. I'm excited to be here with you all today as we explore this incredibly important topic. We hope that throughout this discussion we will all gain a better understanding of what culturally responsive research actually means and the implications it can have on informing policies and programs. We're thrilled to have some of the leading voices on this important topic with us today to define and provide examples of culturally responsive research and outline practical strategies researchers can use to address culture and context in their practice. But before I introduce our panel, I want to make sure that one thing is clear. While my counterparts on the stage have certainly done impressive work and are doing impressive work and important thinking about culturally responsive research, they would also be the first to tell you that we don't have all the answers today. Today is not only about sharing our research findings, but it's also about engaging in a crucial conversation across the research field to learn from one another about how we can do our best work. We're glad you're all with us today, and we look forward to hearing from you. So now what I'm going to do is introduce our panel. At my far left is Alida Meyer. Alida is a senior social science research analyst at the Administration for Children and Families. I know you all have the more detailed bio, so I'm not going to be providing that today. Next to Alida is Paul Elam, and Paul is the Chief Strategy Officer at the Michigan Public Health Institute. Next to Paul is Barbara Chow, the Director of Education at the Heising Simons Foundation. Next to Barbara is Ernest Smith, and Ernest is the Treasurer of the McElderry Park Community Association in Baltimore and a health data analyst at Johns Hopkins Healthcare. And then next to me is Michael Kavanaugh, a research analyst at Mathematica. So now what we're going to do is begin. And as you heard from Diane, it's going to be a moderated discussion. I'm going to start by asking the panel one question or two that I'd like to have everybody on the panel answer. And then after that, we're going to just go into our moderated conversation. We will have questions, at least 30 minutes of questions at the end. So, what do we mean when we say research should be culturally responsive, or research is culturally responsive? Leader, you want to start?
Sure. I will start by saying that my role at Administration for Children and Families is I'm the team lead for community engaged and American Indian and Alaska Native research. And so have had a lot of opportunities to work with Native communities across the United States with the Maternal Infant Early Childhood Home Visiting Program, which is an evidence-based policy program. And one of the things that our colleagues in those communities will say is that you need to understand your own culture. So part of being culturally responsive is to understand where you come from, what's your own training, what's your own family's background, all those kind of things, as well as the culture of the organization that you represent. So if you think about the seat that I'm in, I'm representing the federal government and working with Native communities across the country. And so really thinking about what has the role of the federal government been in doing evaluation and research and other practices in Native communities, and being responsive, being responsible about that, and thinking about how, as we do the work, we really need to do it in a way that builds the capacity of the communities themselves to use data to answer their own questions and to do things that are valuable to them, as well as to contribute, to the greater good by contributing to knowledge. So those are some things that come to mind for me.
Okay. And for Paul, what are you thinking about when we talk about culturally responsive research?
What comes to mind for me is sort of a set of tenets that we should acknowledge and raise up to surround the whole concept of culture. And I think I come at the work understanding that we as a field, as individuals involved in research and evaluation, have different worldviews and different experiences. And I should not assume that we all think the same, come from the same place, have the same values. And so as I engage in every project, my first attempt is to acknowledge what culture actually exists in the work that we're doing to try to sort of ground us in the thinking that's in the room, and then sort of build some tenets through our methods to address that culture that emerges. And so oftentimes we dismiss that and overlook that, and I think to be culture responsive is to put that at the front and center of the work.
Okay. And then Barbara, what does culturally responsive research mean to you?
So a lot has already been said, but I would say that it's three things. It's first, the research question, the methodologies, and execution of the research itself is responsive to the population that's sort of that's being researched. So it is questions that they are interested in answering, as opposed to questions that, for example, others may be interested in answering. Second, there's a recognition, and I think this was already said, that the point of view of the researcher will influence all aspects of the research from design to execution, so that we all carry within us implicit bias. It is not a negative term per se, it is something that we all have, and this is sort of a clear recognition of that. And third is, maybe most obviously, it's just sensitivity to the cultural context in which the research itself is situated.
All right. Ernest, what's your view?
Through much of the work that I've been doing, and I'm pretty much on the side of, or have been operating from the side of communities, where it's about understanding those who those places where the work is going to be done, understanding what it is they desire, and also understanding their values, because it is in the values that make up pretty much most of the cultures that that have joined people together. And unfortunately, because, and one of the things that we've also done is, because there are differences both on the side of researchers as well as those who desire to have the work done, and then the communities themselves, many times what we have done is we've actually set out to establish dictionaries. Because many times people are saying a word, unfortunately that word is not always the same across each one of those areas. For instance, one of the commonalities that where there's a lot of confusion, depending upon who is in the room, is the word community. Who are we talking about? Are we talking about the community, everybody, such as in the case of a city? Are we talking about or the city as a whole, an area of the city, or are we talking about a neighborhood? And so we must look at it from those contexts. And so that's what we try to do. We try to build a context on which the work can be done and then move forward from there.
Okay. And Mike, what's your view on culturally responsive
Well, there's
research?
not much left to say, I don't think, but I would say that for me in working with tribal communities, I echo a lot of what Alita mentioned and Paul as well, that really it's about where you sit and how you choose to engage with these communities, and really acknowledging that the work that we do as researchers is really infused with power. The decisions that we make, everything that we have, everything that we do is cultural. We all have culture, no one is acultural. And so what we decide as researchers to put into the foreground or to put in the background, those are decisions that have power. And I think part of being culturally responsive is acknowledging that and working with communities, engaging communities to identify what research means to them, what evaluation might mean to them, and working with them to identify answers to really complex problems.
Okay, are there key features of a culturally responsive approach? Just throwing that out to anybody.
Key features. I think that for me, being culturally responsive really exists on a spectrum. I think there's a lot of different approaches. I think that traditional research or Western academic research really posits, that the researcher is here and they're sort of isolated doing their work. And then, as you move along the spectrum, there's increasing levels of things like community engagement. And on the other end of the spectrum, there might be something like participatory research or community-based participatory research, where the community is involved in every step of the way through, identifying issues of importance that they want to study, to recruitment and assisting in recruitment and strategies to work through what instruments are going to work and what measures are going to be responsive to their particular culture and actually produce meaningful results for that community. And that, I think, in the end, a key feature is definitely leaving a community better than where it was when you came in, so that research is more than just sort of helicoptering in, taking data, and flying out, that there's some reciprocal appreciation of what you're doing and how you're doing it.
I'm reflecting on something Ernest said. For me, it's really thinking about the evaluation that you're working in. And culturally responsive to me means that you're checking in with that space to find out how they feel about the work. And
While you're doing it?
While we're doing it, early on, while we're doing it, after the fact, and many times I call it drive-by research or drive-by evaluation. I'm a human ecologist by training, and we value understanding the context that we work within. But often that's a hard question to ask. As a professional, we think we do our work very well, and oftentimes we don't ask the question, are we doing it well? And if we are, whose perspective do we value when we get a response? And so to be culturally responsive, I think you have to be vulnerable and put yourself in a situation where you ask that question. How is everyone feeling about this process in terms of a historical approach of how we've done this work? Many times communities don't feel empowered. They don't feel that it was a great experience. And I think we have to do something about that as evaluators to shift the experience for everybody.
For me, my background, it's interesting. I have been involved in the community-based research for a little bit over 15 years. However, I've been involved in research for about 45 years. And because I am what they would call a child protege. So I started out learning research and learning all of the particulars behind it. And so I really felt what Michael was saying when he said that many times the researcher stands in this place by himself, because that's how I thought research was done. I did not have to worry about connecting or touching anyone. And as far as reaching out to anyone, I could care less. However, as time went on and as I began, because of that knowledge of research, I had to begin doing research with people. All of a sudden, it was different. And this thought of having people watching you and monitoring you and realizing that at some point they didn't trust you kind of brought me into a place where it was, well, what am I doing wrong? And then how is it that what I am doing, how are others doing it, and what can I do to help create this balance that is needed that will help bring about the results that is desired both by the community as well as by the researcher. Because at the end of the day, everybody has something that they want to get, but the question is, are we able to do it? Just as it was pointed out by Paul, are we doing those things that are needed that will help to create that balance for everyone?
Are there any signs that culturally responsive research actually promotes better program design, sustainable development, or social inclusion?
I would say yes, strongly. We have been working at ACF on what we call creating a new narrative about the way research and evaluation has been done with Native communities. And that requires holding rigor up to the standards of rigor, is what our work group talked to us about, and they called that cultural rigor. And that to say that a design was rigorous without even knowing what the research question was is not being rigorous. We were all taught that research questions always follow. I mean, research design always follows the research question, but what was happening in Native communities is they could see people coming, knowing what design they were going to use and knowing what was going to happen and not even really sure what the question was. Very true for measurement. And we have numerous examples of the ways in which our very engaged approach with our early childhood programs with tribal leaders and tribal Head Start directors and tribal home visiting, that because of that engagement, the work is more rigorous than it would have been. The measurement is better than it would have been. And what's really cool is we're starting to pull people who didn't realize that they had the researcher bug into the field. And we have at Johns Hopkins Institute, we have a whole training week that is for folks in the early childhood profession who are working in Native communities to come and get training in research so that they can become better consumers of research. So that when people are coming, they're not going to not necessarily change their jobs, but they'll have a better sense of what it is that they deserve because they understand it.
Barbara, you've been focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm wondering, are you seeing any signs that lens impacts program design or development?
Yeah, so I spend a lot of time thinking about how philanthropy can support. I currently work for the Heising Simon Foundation, and our work there focuses on early childhood education. But before that, I was with the Hewlett Foundation for 8 years, and it was sort of K-12 education. So that's my background. And I have seen a kind of, even in this last sort of 10 years, this huge change in the way that foundations are grappling with issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That has been particularly since 2016, I would say, since the significant kind of political events here. I was just talking to somebody recently who said they were getting very steady funding, and then suddenly everything stopped in 2016. They were asking, like, what's going on? Why has that happened? And I think that's because there is a really clear recognition on the part of philanthropy, on the part of politicians, on the part of the whole country that we are in the midst of a very significant demographic shift that is having profound implications for us, our democracy right now, and that philanthropy, when it's at its best, is thinking about that future and about how to kind of knit a community or our country together to thrive in that. And we're not doing that. We're not thriving right now very well, as we said here in Washington, D.C., in the midst of a government shutdown.
Okay. Michael, I want to ask you, Does a lack of responsiveness to culture and context pose a risk to scientific rigor as people talk about it?
I think absolutely, yeah. I think it does in a lot of different ways. I think, and I try to ground this in the work that we do. I think if, the work that I do with tribal communities, if I'm not thinking about the culture and the community that I'm working with, if I haven't looked and thoughtfully thought about the history of that community and the context of that particular community, and I go in and I have this idea that I can collect data and do things just in sort of a rote way, that I could do more harm than good, actually. And I think that one of the things that we've learned through our work with tribal communities is that before you even get to the point where you're going to collect data, you have to go through a rigorous process of understanding what cultural humility means. What are your own privileges? What are your own biases? What does it mean to be a white man and go into a reservation and ask really sensitive questions? And can I do that work? And what does that entail? And so I guess I sort of circle back to being humble and learning and being able to listen to what rigor is, what it might mean to different people, I guess.
Okay. And Ernest, you work in a community that I believe is predominantly Black, right? In
Correct.
East Baltimore.
Yes.
So tell us a little about how you approach the projects you're working on.
Michael used the word just now that it's probably key to how the work is approached, and that's with a sense of humility. Because those of us who are in the community literally understand that what needs to be done cannot be done by us alone. Because because one of the things that we understand is that there is a need to ensure that there's rigor to it. That of late, the big thing is that everything must be evidence-based. So what that means is that we can't just go out and say, well, we did this or we did that, but we must be able to show that there is some value that is attached to it, that there is some effectiveness in that programming. And so what we look at is how do we achieve those objectives, and as we work with different organizations or individuals who come into the community, when someone says they want to do work, we approach them with that sense of humility do you understand what's going on here? We understand you know your work, but do you understand what's going on here in the community? And so what begins to happen is we begin to bring about this paradigm shift in values on both sides, which then brings about begin to help bring about an understanding and create the dialogue that is needed. There are several programs that we have worked on together. One with an institution that has been a dark cloud in East Baltimore for a long time, and that was Johns Hopkins. Yet the community rallied around it because it was important to East Baltimore to understand ways in which to improve its health, and that was the Community Health Initiative. Another one was around the fact that crime was beginning to become rampant in my neighborhood, which is the McElderry Park community. And so there was the city of Baltimore, working with the city of Baltimore, they brought in a project that would help to look at crime reduction. And so the community began working with different organizations and wanted to ensure that what was being done was being measured in a way that the community could understand it, but at the same time that as it went out to different audiences, that it would be able to stand that test of time, because that's the key. And so the Department of Justice supported work that was being done in my community. And now we're working with the foundation on ways in which to create opportunities and for residents in East Baltimore, and that will allow them to also begin to look at ways in which to bring more programming, to also support themselves in terms of if there are initiatives that they're interested in bringing, going out and getting that data. But the key here, and literally what we have done is establish the values, establish the work plans. And this is being done by residents. The researchers had not even been brought in yet. And so please, when we think about this, think about the fact that many times the people in these neighborhoods actually know what it is they want to do, what needs to get done, but and as researchers, how we benefit is we come in to support those efforts. And that's what we have been able to develop. So what that ensures is it's not us who is looking for the seat at the table. It's everyone else that is coming in to support the work that we're trying to get done. And that becomes that important point around how culturally responsiveness comes into play, because you begin to value the expertise, the experience, and the work that has been done by the people in those communities. Whether it be an Indian community and a predominantly African American community and Asian community. Everyone knows what they need, what they want, and are simply asking that you help support them with what they are doing and how they understand they need that support.
I want to build on Ernest's example where he talked about East Baltimore and hear from other people on the panel about some examples of research that either you've done or you've seen that you think did a particularly good job of being culturally responsive. Anybody want to start?
One initiative comes to mind immediately related to the Flint water crisis in Michigan. We had several efforts that were started to respond to the issues that were in that community, and most of the initial thinking was focused on the needs of children. And AARP showed up and asked the question, what do our seniors need in the community? And it was very clear that the plan of action that was being developed was really focusing on a special population of young children and adolescents, and many strategies were being developed. The deployment of water resources, ramping up to replace filters and install new filters, thinking about finances that need to be put in place for medical care and for the replacement of pipes. And had AARP not shown up and reached out to the elderly population, and a large deal of them were disabled, the strategies that were in place were not going to benefit them. And so a report was generated that talked about their inability to access the locations that were being set up community-wide. Just the labor of lifting a cart of water, many people in the community couldn't do those things. They were using metrics on how many filters were distributed, but not how many were actually properly installed and actually being utilized. And so when we begin to look at the numbers for that particular population and raise up their voice, the whole strategy shifted. And it took 2 or 3 additional months and added to our timeline, but it was well worth doing because the whole governor's strategy in response to that was shifted based on one report.
That's a great example. Anybody else? Have an example to share? Go ahead.
I'd like to raise up an example. As I had mentioned, there was a crime reduction initiative, and one of the things that happened, and another project that I'm working on now was the work that was done with this crime reduction initiative was brought to light because it had been presented, and the project is actually beginning to grow. That in Baltimore City, most people have heard about Baltimore City, about the murders and about how many murders have happened over the last few years and how that number has creeped up substantially. However, and one of the things that was always happening is McElderry Park was actually one of the communities. If you wanted to find out what a problem community was like, here is a community that had a number of issues. And one of the things that we said is we could change that dynamic if given the opportunity to do so. And so the city of Baltimore said, here you go, tell us what it is you need, show us how we can support you, and we will do that. And so what has happened is over the last, as crime was going up across Baltimore City, my community actually is one of the few communities in the city of Baltimore during an 18-month period that ended in April of last year that did not have one murder or fatal shooting. It actually helped to lower the unemployment rate by utilizing individuals in the community. And interestingly, the seniors who knew who each of the young men and women were because they were their babysitters, they were their caretakers. So they knew how to reach out to them and get them to those programs that could support them and get them to the jobs. Utilizing individuals like that, bringing them into this process, and then utilizing individuals who have transformed their lives, who have been to jail, as some of the ways in which, as individuals who would help to mentor these individuals. And so my community, as a note here says, went 543 days without a firearm homicide from October 2016 through April of 2018. And unfortunately, over the last few months, there have been an uptick in the number of homicides. However, the growth of those homicides have still not been at the same rate as the rest of the city. So, and out of that, what we have been able to do is we have been able to actually capture some statistics that are part of that show that the program has been successful, that there is a lot of work that is being done, and the city and a number of other organizations, including foundations, have now moved towards supporting it and spreading it across the city into other communities, and with the intent of looking at it from a cultural lens as to how it will impact those communities. And that's a wonderful success story because it moves so many communities now and so many people, and it looks at how it will benefit those areas.
Barbara, I know in the in the education space, do you have a success story you want to share?
I was gonna, maybe the opposite of success
Okay, you're going to give us a failure story. Let's hear that one.
Failure story sounds harsh, but so there's a very famous study that was done by Walter Mischel in, I don't know, probably the 60s or 70s, called the Marshmallow Test, that you may have heard of. Probably most of you are nodding. And that was that, they put marshmallows in front of kids, and then they gave them the chance they said, you can have one now immediately, or if you wait 10 minutes or 5 minutes or something, you can get two later. And they found a high correlation between delayed gratification, the kids that waited, and life outcomes. It turned out that study was based upon a handful of young kids in Palo Alto and in the sort of around the Stanford area, which made sense because he was a researcher there. And when they replicated that study later with a much larger sample size, much more diverse sample size, they found a very different set of results. And so that thinking, though, about sort of delayed gratification had so infused, I think, the way that we think about early childhood, the way we think about ourselves as parents. It had this kind of profound impact, but it turned out to be not all that accurate. And there's a lot of other data about certainly children in poverty and the reasons why that may not be the rational decision to actually just delay gratification. That kind of counters that. So I think it's that getting the sample right, of course, is a pretty fundamental issue anyway in research. But But that was an example of something which did not produce the results we would have hoped. It was not generalizable for those reasons. So I think it's maybe an argument for this kind of work.
I'd like to
Yeah.
second that. I would say that the home visiting evidence-based policy is based on, I mean, it's fantastic, but the research, 25 years old of a lot for some of the evidence, some of the programs that are on the lists. And I think in order to move into a space that we need to be in, where we are able to see how does something that was found to be effective in one context in this kind of particular point in time, and maybe over here and maybe over here, how do we take that to a national scale? How do we have impact across different types of communities, and how do we help people think about staffing when the staffing in certain places, there aren't people with that particular background or education, that in order to move in that direction, you've got to get a lot of people on board caring about the process, caring about wanting to do this, and it can't be funded at those National Institutes of Health levels that a lot of those original studies were funded at. So we need to be in a place where a lot of people can, a lot of different ways of building evidence can occur. So for example, how can we use performance measurement, or how can we use continuous quality improvement cycles? How can we use other, descriptive approaches, implementation studies, where we're not able to have all this control and all those sorts of things and still build the knowledge. And so it's kind of, we're in a place where we need to have more complex understandings of what's going on and be able to use more complex designs, have more people at the table in order to it seems to me, to move to a place where we have public health impact, because we haven't gotten to public health impact by trying to just replicate things that were effective somewhere else in new places, because in many cases, we don't even know what it means to replicate, because we don't have really good ideas of what it meant. What are we having fidelity to? What are the mechanisms of action? What do we think are the things that make the difference? And so it's a lot more complex than maybe just taking a program off a shelf and doing it in the same way that they did it over here. That's not going to get us to public health impact. And so I think that's another example of why moving into this more complex realm that takes much more time to do, much more listening back and forth, much more expectations for measurement, for example, than perhaps have been required of the type of research that got us to a place where we started to believe in evidence-based policy.
Michael, do you have an example, either good or bad, that you want to share on?
Yeah, I've got basically what you just said really resonates with me, and it's just, and something Paul said earlier, being vulnerable, being able to iterate, and being open to failure, I think is a big part of the research process. And it reminds me of, taking new approaches to things like evaluation or doing an evaluability assessment, but really trying to ground it with the community that you're working with, and working with them in a way that you're up and out front with, I'm not the expert on your community, you are. You're from this community, and I want to hear your story. And I think, we're working with several tribal grantees on a project surrounding child welfare right now, and one of the things that we're really interested in is doing this evaluation in a really culturally sound way, in a community-based kind of participatory way. And so as part of this work, we were going to do an evaluability assessment to sort of see how these grantees are going to approach their work, and thinking about it, how we sort of normally approach this is, all right, what sort of administrative data do they have, and what's their infrastructure, what's their capacity, and and how can we do this in a way that's still in keeping with their cultures. And so there wasn't really a wheel for us to sort of recreate. We looked, and we had this indigenous work group that we were working very closely with, who were just, they're knowledge bearers, they're people on the ground who've grown up living in their cultural ways. And so we took our best crack at it, and we gave them these indicators of how we would assess do this evaluability assessment to move forward, and they sort of just said, nope, this isn't going to work. This is way too Western. If you try to bring this into a tribal community, you won't get through the door. It's just not going to work. And I think that's such a key part of the process, though, is to have those difficult conversations, to open yourself to say, I'm not the expert. It's okay that I'm not the expert. Embrace that and use it as a platform to learn from other people that have knowledge. Just because I have a graduate degree doesn't make me an expert on their community. And so what we were able to do was iterate, work together, and completely change the way that we were thinking about the evaluability assessment. And so we created a storytelling framework. We learned that the oral tradition and storytelling is how knowledge is shared and conveyed. And even before we got to that point of we're going to do this evaluability assessment, we set forth this path of before we even get there, how do we act in the community? Before we start to try to even ask these questions, what are the things we need to do? Do I need to bring a gift? Is there a traditional welcome? Are we going to share food together? How should I approach these people? And these are all questions you have to ask before you even start to do the work, I think. And so that's one example of the importance of being vulnerable, failing, and iteration, and how important that is in the process of creating something really meaningful, I think, for communities that you hope to serve.
Sharon, could I share one, as that comment was being made? The Kellogg Foundation is funding TRHT across our country, Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. 18 sites, 4 of the sites are in Michigan. And something that they're doing that's I think, a paradigm shift is they're funding community to drive the work. And community foundations in about 3 of our sites in Michigan, and then a university in the other site. But it's very clear when you mention diversity, inclusion, and equity that the drivers of the work are community. The grant recipients might serve as the administrative agency, but community is leading the work. And it was not very long where the community that's been empowered came to the table and began to meet with these major institutions and said, now that we're driving, we want to tell you very quickly what we've had to endure the last 20, 30 years of working using your framework and your tools and your models. And the practice is shifting. We're all uncomfortable now who've been trained in these methods, and we're sitting down working with community. And so I think it's telling, and it's forcing us to come together and have dialogue about where is the middle ground. And the term rigor was thrown out earlier. I think some of us are in privileged spaces to even define what rigor actually means. I think we have to go back to the board and say, what does rigor really mean? And it needs to be a term that involves everyone that's impacted by the work. And I wrote down the definition of rigor. One, it's methodological rigor can be defined as the soundness or precision of a study in terms of planning, data collection, analysis, and reporting. That definition does not include community or culture in any way. And so I think we have to evolve our practice to be more inclusive of the field. And so I think this work that Kellogg is doing might be a place for us to look to see how practice is actually emerging as we do this work in a culturally responsive way.
You think that's cutting edge, then I'll take it, right? Barbara, you want to say something on this one?
I think Kellogg has been a huge leader within philanthropy, and there's so many analogs to things you were talking about in terms of research and grant-making practices. A lot of foundations, for example, and major federal institutions fund sort of a small, discrete set of researchers who then kind of develop their own, kind of lengthy set of research articles that creates more. So there's something that is very kind of recurrent about that. And if we're going to kind of break this cycle, we're going to have to do things very differently. And so I was thinking about grant makers, many do not allow unsolicited proposals. For example, if any of you have ever tried to get a grant from a large national foundation or a large national funder, that might need to change. The places in which the grant proposals are made available. I've heard of foundations doing really interesting things where they've held sessions for sort of new proposals in community centers. They've held them at night. They've had food there. I mean, there's a set of things that they've done which have to really try to sort of shift who it is that's even applying for the funding in the first place, because I genuinely wanted that, and that is not going to be the same sort of usual suspects on the usual timeline.
I want to spell out the unsolicited grant, unsolicited request rule and how it impacts communities and people of color, diverse groups, the non-in crowd, right? I mean, because when you think about it, in order to be solicited, you have to be someone the foundation already knows, right? Or somebody knows somebody who sent you there, basically, right? And what do we know about those groups? No, I'm opening it, but you could tell us something about the people, the diversity of those groups.
I mean, a few things about the diversity of the groups and also of the philanthropic sector. You may have heard these statistics, but let me just cite them. If you look at the philanthropic sector, 93% of foundation CEOs are white. 83% of the executive staff are white. Those statistics almost completely mirror the nonprofit sector, who are the foundation's grantees. They are the same. If you look at grant making, there's some statistics that came out of the Foundation Center several years ago. There are a lot of imperfections with the data, but I thought they were interesting and instructive. 7% of grant making from the largest foundations are specifically allocated to support racial and ethnic minorities, although the population is closer to 40%.
You said 7%?
7%. And many fewer sort of lower levels for LGBT and communities and people with disabilities. So there is kind of a disproportionality that I think certainly the foundation world is grappling with, and it very much mirrors the research world, I imagine, as well. I mean, I don't know the statistics as well, but I think that's part of the reason that we're all kind of waking up and looking at ourselves very hard right now.
So what skills are required of culturally responsive evaluators, and how can we build a pipeline of researchers skilled in culturally responsive evaluation?
One thing we talk about is, with this roadmap for creating a new narrative on research and evaluation with tribal communities, is that there's two areas of action where things have been weak historically. And if you can focus on those two areas as you're doing the work and strengthening them, that can really drive. And those are relationships and skill building, and having a bi-directional approach with that, where you're doing that skill building, where the researchers and evaluators are learning, as well as the communities are building their own data skills, their own evaluation skills, and that you're building that relationship back and forth. So there are those two pieces. And part of the skill building, I think, for evaluators is to have the humbleness to go back and learn methods that they're uncomfortable with, that they don't know about, and that they get trained or they reach out to other people, and to have a deep pocket of quasi-experimental designs, of different approaches, of qualitative methods, of things that can really allow you to creatively address questions for communities that may have very small sample sizes, or who may have fundamental disagreements and will not approve any research that involves a comparison group, because it is not, the values are not there to have this comparison. And so I think this bidirectional learning, having a kind of a lifetime orientation towards learning, and then this idea that you need to continue to learn about different kinds of methods, and to have this approach of continuing to learn. I think those are three things that come out for me as really important.
Ernest?
I totally agree with what it is you're saying. As a matter of fact, the project that we're doing now, the East Baltimore Research Project, is a interesting project in that the first thing that happened is everyone came in and we had consultants, we actually have foundation people, we have the community advisors. And what was funny about it is nobody in the room trusted anybody else, which was interesting, yet we attempted to do the work. And so what began to happen is we had to literally establish that baseline of understanding, which was, why are you here? What do you want? Because we all understood the foundation was in this, because they are not, our experience was, you're not going to give us money and not have, you're not going to do this and not have some, you're not going to put skin in the game and not want to play this game. So what is it you want? Consultants, why are you here? What is it that you hope to gain out of this? What is your career path? Because generally when this happens, the people who come in and do the research get these career jumps, you know, the proposal comes off, everything works well, so they get a career jump. What is the direction? How long can we anticipate you being here before we begin to see someone else? And then for the community advisors, after all of you have moved on and you are changed out, where is that going to leave us? Are we going to have to start all over again with a new group of individuals? What began to happen is we established a baseline. Here's everyone's position in this. Here are the things we will need. This is what will need to happen as far as us taking this out to the community. We're going to need to teach people, because those of us who are here now may not be here 2 or 3 years out. Who's going to continue this work? So it was literally this a willingness to translate between each other, established set of values. I spoke of a dictionary earlier, but it's literally a playbook. What's along the way, here's how things are going to go. And everyone that comes in is brought in with the understanding that a playbook exists, and you will either live by it or keep moving. It's funny as all get up, but that is what happens. And,
How long did it take to build that playbook?
Let's see, it took us almost a year to build the playbook. It took us another almost 6 months to bring in the research firm who is now beginning to play in our arena. But interestingly, they're coming in. We understand what the standard research approach is, because most come with an understanding that there's a question, or they are going to create a question, as opposed to seeing what is the question of the group or the community or the people that are going to be impacted. And we're saying, no, we don't need you to do that. What we need you to do is begin teaching the people in the community how to do the work. So we've established that we want resident researchers, we want individuals who can do data collection, data analysis, data evaluation, data and information dissemination. Because the key at the end of all of this is whose story is going to be told. We have to think about the story. And that story must be inclusive of, agreed upon at the beginning, that it will be inclusive of everyone. How the foundation played their part, how the consultants played their part, how the research firm played this part. But it will be not the research firm's story or the foundation story, but it will be our story, a true community-based story that is now responsive, not just to those impacted, but it will be responsive to the foundations. It will be responsive to the career growth of a consultant. It will be responsive to the people in the community, because they have learned new skills that will help them. For many of these individuals, they didn't have jobs, but everyone, and this is something the research firm told us, everyone knows how to do research, but everyone has not been trained in how to do it effectively. That blew everyone away, and for them, it is interesting that we're going with that. And Tuesday night showed us so many. It kind of blew away the research firm that has been selected, because they did not realize how well community people really understand research. So again, understanding those baselines and setting the values and making the growth, because it's all a part of what needs to happen, and knowing what everybody wants. If we don't establish that, we're going to be lost.
So on that happy note, I think I'm going to turn it over to questions and see if we have any questions. Yes. Wait, a mic is going to come around. And if you just tell us your name and your affiliation.
Nicola Blank, National Disability Rights Network. One question as we talk about culture and stuff, what about like disability? Because I'm a disability rights advocate. I'm on the autism spectrum.
Okay, let's talk about the disability community. I know, Paul, you mentioned the issue that came up in Flint. Do you have any other?
Absolutely. I think the tenets that we propose, we have a white paper called Considerations for Conducting Evaluation Using a Culturally Responsive and Racial Equity Lens. When I use the term evaluand, it means that wherever we're located to do our work and whatever special population that we're engaged in, we start right there with engagement with that particular community. Ernest mentioned sort of how do we define community. It really is the group we're working with and the folks who will be impacted, the folks who are funding the work, the folks that are facilitating the work, and then we can build out from that core group. But I think the tenets really call for early on engagement, ongoing engagement, and making sure, as he just eloquently said, that when we begin to tell our story, that all of those voices are raised up. And so I don't think this is really about racial groups or just ethnic groups. It's really about the place in which we're actually doing our work. And if we hold dear to the tenets and get all of those who are invested in the work to honor that, acknowledge the timeline it takes to do that work, acknowledge the resources that are required, the training. I might be very culturally competent and can do responsive work in the space around race and ethnicity. And as you just asked the question, I might not know a lick about the disability community. I need to build a team that can be responsive to your needs and apply those same tenets.
Okay. I'll also say for the online audience, please email in your questions and we will be answering them. Yes, you have one here?
Boyer, recently retired from the federal government, and I now working with my diversity advantage company. So my question, to follow up with my colleague from the National Disability Rights Network, is very interesting about how does the media impact culturally responsive research with reinforcing myths about certain cultures and communities. For example, with disability coverage. The media loves to do the pity or the hero stories. And when you're studying the community of people with individuals with disabilities, it is wider than any of the cultures represented on the stage and the cultures and communities that you spoke about, because within the disability community, they're not always going to agree either, because you've got folks that are deaf and hard of hearing, people that are blind, limited vision, people from the autism spectrum disorder, people with neurological disabilities, people with mobility disabilities that can range from anything from spina bifida to spinal cord to back injuries, all of that. And yet when research is done about people with disabilities, it often lumps it all into one thing by studying only a limited amount. So my question is sort of two-part. Media coverage about all different communities can really hinder the responsive cultural research that you guys are doing, and the research that is done about individuals with disabilities is always going to be flawed.
Can I answer that one? Paul said a word that is important, and that's around place. Because no matter what the place, every one of those individuals that you named will probably be present. Someone, it may not be 100 people from the autism spectrum, but it will be a few. There will be those that are blind. There will be those that are deaf. There will be the racially disabled. everyone will be present. And so when you look at it from that standpoint, instead of trying to go in and deal with a single group of individuals, if we go from a place-based perspective, what we will find is we will hit all of those individuals, regardless of race, ethnicity, or disabilities.
Or gender,
Or sexual orientation or gender. Because everyone will be, all of those possibilities will exist. And if we establish those baselines and if we take all of those things into consideration and make sure, because then you can capture those needs more effectively. And what you then begin to do is those, rest assured, those individuals that show up initially are going to will be advocating for others that whose voices aren't being heard, because guess what? Most of the time they don't come because they don't think their voice will be heard. They will begin advocating and they will begin to lift up those individuals, and those individuals will begin to show up. It is important that when we go in, that we recognize that we think only one group of we look at only one group of individuals being the target and the most impacted, but at the same time, there's a lot more people, and so we have to take everyone into consideration in this process. Otherwise, what will happen is the responsiveness will be diminished. We will get the news stories that you spoke of how this group was lifted up and they were thrown away. All of that will happen. I just lost my mind.
Raising the intersectionality point. You know, you talked about it, Paul, in Flint, how Flint's a predominantly black community, but you were, the focus was originally children, right? A piece, black children, but then it was, black elders, right? It could have been black disabled people, it could have been black LGBT community. You know, it's, I guess, it makes it a lot more complicated. You mentioned the complexity of the challenge. Intersectionality totally makes it complicated. It makes it probably better too, right? Because then you are picking up all the different dimensions. I don't have the answer, right? I'm just saying intersectionality is, that's your place piece, right? Because if I'm just focusing on this place, then I'm going to make sure intentionally I hit all these different dimensions that we just described.
Well, whether I intend to or not, they're going to show up, and and what's interesting about it, as Paul pointed out, they will make you pay attention. You will begin to have to pay attention, and that's what we have to think about. That we have to remember those unintended events that will occur along the way, and how will we gear ourselves for those. That Paul's group was prepared to do it, but how often do we all think about that, and what that says to us as we begin to think about even culturally responsive research? We have to think about the possibility of of the impact that this process will have on not just the ones we're targeting, but also on those that are hanging out on the fringes.
Okay, we got more questions. Whoa, lots of. Whoa. Okay, online, and then we'll go back there. Okay.
Yes, we've got quite a few online questions, and I'll take the first one from Angelina Callis from the University of Washington. She asks the panel, as a current MSW graduate student who is interested in research, she's wondering if someone can speak more to the term cultural rigor. How do we explain the importance of rigor and then set guidelines for what that would be with the community?
I use that term because it has a lot of, I think, face validity. There's something about it that feels like, yeah, we should be thinking about that. We've tried really hard to define it, and I think part of what needs to happen is a space for taking the time to do that. And so I defined it as holding rigor up to the standards of rigor, which means, you know, we use the term rigor in the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation to talk about the confidence you have about the findings. So creating a study in such a way that you have this confidence about what you're learning about. And so without, if the only rigor that you're thinking about is statistical methods, contrasts, internal validity, being able to say that your causes were related to, something that you were able to control and move rather than thinking about the broader context, then you are not being as rigorous as you need to be in order to feel really confident about what you're learning. And so I wouldn't, so we've tried, anyways, that's what I would say.
Okay.
We've developed self-assessment tools around cultural competence in terms of building your knowledge and awareness, and then thinking about how you take that competence and become more culturally responsive. So there are many tools out there. We've established one where we really look at, are you doing your own work around these areas? What's your familiarity with the space you're working in? And it shouldn't just be, I have a cousin who reflects this demographic. I mean, literally, there's a set of things that we begin to have you think about, and liquor sale items. And if you're really not confident in saying, I'm doing this all the time in my work, then it really allows you to do some self-reflection and say, I need to improve my practice in this space. And I'll go back to my earlier comment. I think I ask the community oftentimes, how is this working for you? The community has to be the number one stakeholder you're receiving your input from. And if they feel things are moving in the right direction, I think that's the one indicator and proxy I really hang my hat on. Every project I've started, evaluation or research typically starts with a conversation around how the last project didn't go over very well. And so I have to sit there and listen to what the last evaluator screwed up on and make sure that I don't make the same mistakes. And so I think if we get into that practice of just having that dialogue, then I think community will tell you if you're meeting their needs. And so to the point that was made earlier, I don't think this throws out the current definition of rigor. We're just trying to build upon that. So there isn't one or the other.
I think the how is where people always stumble. I think that the context drives the how, in most cases. And that's the important thing to recognize, is that it's going to look a little different in every place that you work. And I think we have to be careful too about things like cultural competency, that it's not just that we can read a few documents and gain this amount of awareness that you need in order to work with a particular community or have the skills now I'm competent and I can go out and do that. That's not, I don't think, the way that it really works in real life. I think you have to have, it's an ongoing process, a lifelong process of gaining that awareness of cross-cultural understanding and that competency, but also continually self-reflecting, being, what is cultural humility? It's putting my assumptions aside about a particular group. It's about asking when I don't know something, those sort of things constantly throughout the work, being self-critical, along with those other things that you mentioned, like having an assessment of the people that you're working with.
All right, we had a question back here.
Hi, my name is Amy Lulinski, and I'm with the State of the States and Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Project. Hi, Nicole. Thank you for your question, and to the person to your left who helped facilitate that discussion on intersectionality, which was my first question, so I can go to my second question, which is with regard to the inclusion of citizen researchers. I would be interested to hear some of your reflections on that and whether or not compensation was included. Thank you.
For us, it is a must. And let me say it to you like this. Too often in the past, roughly up until about 12 years ago, many times when researchers came into communities, what would happen is they wanted individuals in the community to help them with the research, but the key is that they wanted them to volunteer. And volunteering simply meant a pro bono pay scale. For anyone who doesn't know, that it's free. And unfortunately, for what began to happen is initially I actually started doing that because I had a business. I was working as a consultant. And unfortunately, I began to realize, oh, what this is taking, they began to request more of my time than I wanted to give. And all of a sudden it was like, oh, stop. We have to figure out a payment arrangement for me. But then it was, well, can you get these? I said, oh, we're going to have to work out a payment arrangement for everyone, because what you're asking of people is a difference between asking someone, well, do you have an hour a month or maybe an hour every other week versus giving you 10 to 12 hours a week to work on this project and to some extent pretty much collect the data, support you in helping you to understand and helping to make sure you analyze that data. No, what do you pay someone who does this work? And so one of the things that we began to move into every project, anyone who came into the community, from, interestingly, from the nice foundations who try to support much of the work we do, all the way to the federal government, we ask for pay scales. We began to set those pay scales. It is imperative for all communities, whether you be the disabled community, whether you be the autistic community, I don't care who you are, you too have value. And that is one of the key points that must be lifted up. Everyone has value. We want the work done, but we don't want to pay people. And at the end of the day, most of the people who are doing the work come into these communities, most of them are making 60, 70, 80, sometimes upward of $120,000 a year. And yet you want me to do it. I'm struggling every day just to make ends meet. And you don't even want to pay me $10 an hour for the 12 hours a week that you want me to work. And guess what? I'll never touch. If I live a lifetime at 10 hours a week, I'll never touch, 4 years of your salary. For anyone who wants to know it, 10 hours a week for an entire year will not touch the salary of someone who makes $120,000 a year if I did it for 20 years. Thank you.
Okay, I think you made that point, Ernest.
The exact,
Same
based
amount?
on our American Indian, our technical work groups, for example, we have, we always make, for the FACES study, for example, we always make sure that the rates that people are getting are the same,
No matter who.
all the expertise.
That's great. That's a
Absolutely.
good principle. We had an online question?
Sure do. This question comes from Raja Ayagari from Mathematica. How do you build the time and investment needed to build these relationships into project plans and budgets? How do you communicate the importance of community perspective to potential funders and potential clients?
By having forums.
Some of us are writing our RFPs that way already.
Oh, good. Okay.
And also, when you come in, don't come in thinking that you're going to walk in and have people know. It means hire the people in the community who will become your guides, and who will, because one of the things that I learned as I was being trained to be a researcher from a small child growing up, get a mentor. Mentors help guide you over the rough spots. They take you help you to understand the ways in which to get things done. And when we come into community, why don't we ask the individuals there to be our mentors and pay them the wage that is rightly due them in that capacity to be those guides? Just saying.
I think
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, the constraints are, that's one of the big challenges, I think, about doing culturally responsive work and engaging with communities, is that it takes time to do that. And the budget constraints are ever present. And so I think part of it is to Alita's point, reshaping the way that RFPs and work is proposed. And we're seeing that. I think we do see that there is more time allotted, and especially with some of the work we do with American Indians and Alaskan Natives, and then also the foundations that we work with, but also being mindful that if it takes time, that you're not wasting time, that you're right away engaging with that community in whatever way that you can, whatever way that the budget will allow you to. I know that it's, wherever we can, we'd love to be interfacing face-to-face with these community members to show that respect, that we care about their knowledge and we want to be present for them. But it also means being innovative. So it means maybe we can't visit you in person. Maybe it means we're going to have virtual conversations often. And so that we're engaging in that way. And that at the onset, we're having that dialogue, that intergroup dialogue that sets the stage for good relationships moving forward. Because if you don't have that dialogue, I think that's often the stumbling block, especially in a tight budget, is you get on a work group call, you're working with the community, you're in an advisory group role, and it's just quiet. Nobody's talking. And it's because we haven't had the difficult conversation yet. And that you were talking about, it's what are the expectations? Where are we coming from? Let's put it all on the table, and then then move forward and put forth like a purposeful plan for how we're going to communicate and how we're going to do the work. And so I think within the budgetary constraints that you have and knowing all that is one approach. It's just, be thoughtful.
I think from a strategic level, we have a vision and mission statement that is aligned around this work. And we have core values that are aligned around this work. And so we believe we exist to advance good public policy that's really going to impact everyone, not just groups of people. And two of our core values are around social justice and equity, and one is around authentic relationships. And so when you ask about the funders and others we choose to partner with, we intentionally get involved in partnerships where we have mutual core values. And so many of the funders we're working with, there's an overlap in these core values. And if we find that we're in partnership with folks who don't have these values, the partnership will probably end pretty quickly. And so we're not trying to force people to do this work. We do spend a fair amount of time educating folks about the value of this work and what you won't be able to answer, what you won't be able to do without using these approaches. But sometimes we just have to say, we can't do this work with you because there's a conflict.
Barbara, I wanted to hear your view as a funder and in the foundation community. Are you seeing the foundations being more open to spending time for this relationship building in a year and a half to build the playbook, et cetera, before we get started?
There's this, I think broadly, this dawning realization, as I said, about the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion. That's starting to show up in grant proposal guidelines, for example, the questions that funders are asking, both philanthropic, sort of private and also public funders. And so, I think the answer is the sort of funding community is shifting in this direction. So hopefully it will eventually catch up with where the researchers are, and there won't be this sort of disjoint sense that people are feeling right now, that they want to be spending time and effort into it, kind of creating this trust, and it will take more time and cost more money, and that somehow or other that's going to be suppressed or not supported. So I think these things are kind of converging towards each other.
Okay.
But the main thing I would just say, if you're making that argument, is just that, as we've described here today, if you do this well, you're much more likely to get to the truth, whatever the truth is, right? And that is what we're all seeking anyway to begin with. So if that is kind of the cost of truth, then that is the cost of truth.
All right, I think we have questions in the back I want to make sure we get to, or maybe not. Okay, you want to, right here?
Hi, my name is Lauren Gilbert from the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University, and I just wanted to go like one step removed from where we're currently talking. What are the implications for efforts to summarize the literature on a particular subject, for instance? For example, like if I were trying to do a Cochrane review on some of this stuff, that on literature that was using this, I could see it potentially getting docked because of the concerns that tend to take priority in those reviews. Just as one example.
Their emphasis on internal validity. Exactly. Yeah. I think that is. We talk about a learning agenda. All federal agencies are encouraged to have a learning agenda. We have a learning agenda that involves looking at the evidence base and really emphasizing internal validity. But that's just a piece of the overall effort towards having better outcomes for children and families. And so it is not the only thing that's going to make a difference. It's a piece of that, and it's the piece that talks to us about internal validity. It's not the piece that talks to us about all truth. And so there's a place for that, and I think that that is certainly how we think of the role of a systematic review within a broader learning agenda, which has an iterative process that also, one of the things that we haven't talked about here, but that comes to mind for me, is the role of technical assistance as we do research and evaluation. How can we make sure that the things that we're learning are then being shared with communities that aren't directly involved in creating that knowledge or in that research? So there's this way that there's this broader benefit to more communities than just those doing the research to applying and trying that out through technical assistance. And that's a big part of our learning agenda, is how do we make sure that what we learn helps improve thinking about the workforce for home visiting and those kinds of things.
I know we had a question here, and then I'll go over there. Okay. Let's learn.
Hi, my name is Latoya Parker, and I'm a graduate student at Howard University. And I'm curious about whether or not you all have ever experienced or encountered any pushback at all from funders or even the stakeholders all involved, including some of your peers, researchers, and evaluators, when it comes to culturally responsiveness and the definition behind that, because I think that sometimes whoever defines it and how they defined it could potentially affect the way in which people perceive it and going forward, and whether or not they even want to engage in that sort of research.
Got to have a long view, is what I would say. That this can make some folks feel pretty uncomfortable. And it's certainly in my own career, there's different points in time where I was like just really shocked that my good intentions weren't having the effect that I was hoping, and that's kind of can be professional. There's a awakening part for that, and so I think it's really important to have a long view about this and to be thinking about colleagues that I can think of a number of people who I won't name that I've known for 15 years, 10 years, 30 years, or whatever. They're not in the same place that they were the first time I got super excited talking to them about action research and Kurt Levine and all that kind of stuff. People change, and so I think that's for me, that's been really important, is to have this long view about where people are with this, and that it's an empirical question in some ways, and I've seen a lot of evidence that taking this approach is really a very important part of the ways in which research and evaluation can help make a difference. Without this, we are limited in our impact, I think.
We have our last two questions. I want to go over here. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Janet Phoenix at the George Washington School of Public Health. My question really had to do with taking the perception of communities into perspective as you're designing research. My experience tells me that oftentimes the research questions and our approach to research is fairly narrowly focused and time limited simply because of the nature of it, and that when we're working with communities, that Their perspective does take kind of the long view, and they would like us to clearly articulate what the benefits might be for the community that go beyond perhaps building the ability of certain people to engage in the research process or monetary compensation, but really what is the long-term benefit of the research itself? What are we leaving behind that will be a benefit? And how do we convince our funders that that's an important piece of what we're doing and that without that we can't move forward effectively and ethically?
To help with that question, because sometimes there are projects, as much as we'd love to see the long view on them, that do come with time constraints. And no matter what the project is, there will always be constraints. And so, as it was pointed out, we have to put that on the table. You have to put that on the table up front. You have to state that here's what I'm constrained by. These are the things that this is what I am working with, and I need your help to get from here to there. Understand, if we don't begin our communication up front, and remember, communication started the moment you walked in that door. So if you have to begin communicating these things, understand, they're people. We're all people. We all understand that there are jobs that must be done. But in terms of generally how research generally happens, it's most of the time it happens over these long, drawn out periods, and and then people never come back. Please inform, and then work and understand. If there's a methodology in terms of or a way in which it needs to be done quickly, guess what? Instead of you having to run around and find, say, 100 people who can help you get it, and it may take you the next year to do so, people in the community know some of the people you would need to talk to, some of the people you will need to meet with, and can help you to get through that very quickly. But if we don't know up front, your project may only be a year, but the way the community will approach it is that you probably have 3 years to do this, and who cares how if you get your response in 6 months, you're going to get paid no matter what. Help us to understand, and then out of that, and our helping you, how it will benefit. Because when you wrote it, you need to also take that into consideration. What is it you intend to do for the community in doing this, even if it takes a year? And how is it that you expect the community to come back and help you? Too often, we're only on one side of the coin. You're a person, you know what it is. If someone were coming to you, what would you want? Then feel that way about the people you're going to. What is it that I can give to them? And at the same time as I ask them to help me get to the end of this.
Okay, I just say it sounds like what's wanted is a feedback loop for the community, right?
Yeah.
You do all this research, at some point, there needs to be a report out in that funding request that says you go back to the community and you give them a report, right? Not just a written report, but here's what we found, and why can't you do it along the way? We have one more question, because I know our time is almost up. I want to just get to it.
I'll just add one thing. I think that's the first question that every community asks. When we go to recruit tribal communities, it's the first thing to ask, how is this going to benefit my community? And I think that there is that feedback loop, that you have to be clear that we're going to try and pursue something that's going to have a high utility level for that community in whatever way it's disseminated, and that's going to be meaningful to them. So I'll stop there because we have another question about.
Okay, good.
My name is Rachel Dungan. I'm here on behalf of Academy Health. I wanted to start by thanking.
You're going to have to speak up.
Better?
Yes.
My name is Rachel Dung, and I'm here on behalf of Academy Health. I wanted to start by thanking all the panelists. I think this was incredibly robust, and it's a topic I get very excited about. My work portfolio is in engagement science, being the evaluation and study of engagement practice, what's ethical, what's effective, what works in this community, and why does it not work in that community. And a bulk of my work at Academy Health has been in partnership with an organization called the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI. So my work is health-focused, but I wanted to acknowledge the fact that PCORI has made available a resource on its website. It's called the Engagement in Health Research Literature Explorer. It's an open access repository of literature on engagement science. It documents studies that have effectively included ethical engagement practice. It documents studies including systematic reviews and meta-analyses that document evaluations of engagement practices that provide evidence of the impact of engagement on the rigor of research. I really appreciated the discussion about rigor, so I'm grateful for that. For people who believe in these practices, want to understand better how to implement these practices in given condition-specific communities or given cultural communities, you can go to that online resource and type in a specific condition or a specific stakeholder group, like a faith-based leader or a civil society leader, and you can see how those individuals have been engaged effectively in different research activities in past, and you can also provide naysayers with proof in the form of evidence that might speak to them to document the fact that engagement practice has improved the impact and relevancy of various research activities. So I want to acknowledge that. That's available at PCORI's website. It's pcori.org. And beyond that, I did just want to acknowledge, I think we touched on it a little bit with the last question, but we've heard a lot throughout the day about patient and stakeholder or community engagement, rather, in data collection, study design, production of results. But again, the word dissemination was only mentioned once up until the last response. We haven't really talked about translation, which is figuring out how to communicate those research findings in ways that resonate with the communities that could benefit from those findings. And the literature does show that translation is actually one of the highest impact places that you can engage stakeholders in the process. So I'm wondering from you all why you think that's not done more frequently, and what resources or mindsets do we need to alter in order to improve engagement in translation activities? Thanks.
So I was going to respond to the comment about media earlier, because the way that our office has been responsive culturally is to get on board with moving beyond big fat reports that people don't read. And so if you were to watch the progression of the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation and the ways that we are doing our dissemination, so we tweet, we are on Facebook. I just did like a 2-minute video on the self-regulation and toxic stress series, and boy, did that make me sweat. And we're doing all kinds of work to create 2-pagers, things that really synthesize it. So we have really raised it up, and we do a lot of peer learning and a lot of training of each other, and we really believe that that is the only way that our really relevant work is going to be helpful, is through dissemination. And so I think that in some ways, some engagement with communities has occurred we've done all this research, now can you help us tell everybody why our research is good? And I think that the reason that we've sort of weighed so heavily on this front end is because we believe that community culturally responsive work needs to happen throughout all of that. And a lot of times there's been sort of this light touch at the beginning and light touch at the end, saying, can you help us get our research out there and make it relevant, rather than saying, well, it's not relevant because you didn't start that way 6 years ago. So.
Well, I want to thank you all for attending today's forum. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. Be sure to let us know what you think, how we did on this topic, by responding to the electronic survey, which will be available to all webinar participants at the close of this session, and will be sent to all in-person participants by email. Video from today's event will be posted to Mathematica's site within the next few days. Please join me in thanking our panel for a great discussion.